morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jen Sullivan. I am the Assistant Director here at the library. So if you haven't been to our library before, also welcome. So tonight is our topic of conversation on DEI, along with the town's ad hoc DEI committee. For those of you who live in Woodbridge or are here often, I just wanted to let you know that the town does have an ADA coordinator who you can speak with about any accessibility issues with town property or town buildings. Her name is Jeanette Glicksman, and her card is in the back on the table if you need to speak with her. Just asked to mention that to everybody. So now I'm going to turn this over to Tahara, our co-chair of our town's DEI committee, and she will get the night going. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Appreciate it. Thank you and welcome, all of you. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Tahara Parvez. I co-chair the Town DEI Committee along with Ellen, and a lot of our committee members are here with us tonight. It's a rainy night, great night for a conversation, I think. I'd like to thank the library for hosting us this evening, especially Jen, thank you. She did a lot of behind the scenes work, making this room look extra snazzy for us, and promoting the event. And I'd like to thank the town, our first selectman, for supporting the work that we do here. So one of our committee's primary goals is engaging the community in conversations around a variety of topics that have to do with diversity. And disability awareness is one of those topics that have come up, and we hadn't been able to think of the right way to do it. So I reached out to Jen back in the fall and said, we would love to have this conversation. How can we do it? So Jen connected us with Tim Kellogg, who's here with us tonight. Thank you, Tim, so much for being here. We really appreciate it. I got to know Tim a few months ago, and as we were speaking, it quickly became evident that this is a really important conversation. It's a very big conversation. So we hope to touch on a lot of disability tonight, and its many, many aspects. And it's an important conversation for folks that live in Woodbridge. We learned through our survey, it's been almost 2 years ago now, that a lot of our Woodbridge residents have people in their households that live with a disability. So we're really excited to have this conversation tonight. So I'd like to now introduce Tim, who is our guest speaker tonight. I'll let you get into your story. I'm not going to tell you your story for you, but I really appreciate you being here. Thank you for doing this for our community and for our committee. And steering us in conversation tonight, my fellow committee member, Stephen Lawrence. If you've been to one of our conversations before, you know that Stephen's expert. We couldn't do it without him. I certainly wouldn't do it without him, so I'm really setting you up here.
Yeah.
Okay, so without further ado, I'll turn it over to you guys.
Well, thank you, Tahara, and clearly you can tell I was voluntold that I would be doing this, but was also very happy to. I'll just share that in my own work, I do consulting on philanthropy. About 3 years ago, a little more than 3 years ago, I started doing work with the Disability and Philanthropy Forum, which has a focus on increasing philanthropic support focused on people with disabilities. And it was so eye-opening to me how little I knew. And so in part, I was really excited about having this conversation because I think it's an opportunity to sort of share learnings and experience that I think helps us all to think in a different way. Because one key takeaway from that work that I would want to share is that there is no equity without disability. And there's a way that disability is sidelined and put off in a corner, and in fact, it needs to be central. And we'll talk a bit more about that in our conversation. I'm really excited that Tim has offered to share with us. his experience and perspective. But let's start off with how we're defining disability for the purposes of this conversation. There's no one precise definition, but this is the definition I've been using in the work I've been doing. And that is, people with disabilities encompass a diverse community of individuals who experience physical, sensory, intellectual, developmental, or mental health disabilities, including substance use disorders, as well as chronic illnesses. This includes people who have received a medical diagnosis and who have not, and recognizes that conceptions of disability may vary by context. Disabilities may also be apparent or non-apparent, and individuals may move in and out of the disability status during their lifetimes. Terminology. For the purposes of our conversation this evening, we'll use the term people with disabilities or disabled people interchangeably. What's important is that both terms emphasize the wholeness of individuals. And then, because I am a researcher, I'm going to hit you with a few stats, and then we'll get into the conversation. 1 in 4 adult Americans experiences some type of apparent or non-apparent disability. 1 in 4. According to the CDC, about 1 in 6 children, 17%, aged 3 to 17, have 1 or more developmental disabilities. 7.3 million disabled students are in the US. They make up about 15% of the national public school enrollment. And at Beecher, approximately 11% of students are receiving special services. The unemployment rate for people with disabilities was 7.2% in 2023, about twice that for people who do not have a disability. And in 2022, just over 20% of persons with disabilities in the US were living below the national poverty line, which again was close to twice the national average overall. And locally, as Tahira mentioned, in the Experiencing Woodbridge survey, we had asked local residents if there was one or more people in their households who was a person with a disability, and roughly 1/3 responded affirmatively. Substantial share of our community. And this may be older adults with physical disabilities such as vision or hearing loss or some type of cognitive dysfunction, children with learning disabilities, and individuals living with clinical anxiety or depression, just as a few examples. And there was a way I'll say in my own experience, there were times I thought, oh, that's not a disability. When I looked at it, it's like, oh, it is. And in some ways, because we adapt, we don't necessarily think about it. But it's really, we'll get into this a bit. But talking about what does the individual experience and how does our society need to function differently? All right, that all said, we're going to begin with some Q&A with Tim. But of course, we ultimately want this to be a conversation. So we definitely have some questions for you, and then we really want to hear what you're thinking about all this and your own experiences. So Tim, we'll start off with that big softball question. Tell us a little bit about yourself. To the extent you feel comfortable sharing, how has your experience of disability influenced your years growing up, in school, as a working professional, and just living day to day in the great state of Connecticut?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me here tonight. That's a loaded question, because if I was going to talk about what I'm comfortable talking about, I'd leave the room right now. So with that said, yesterday I read a quote from the Forbes quote of the day that comfort and growth cannot coexist. So I think I'm about to put that to the test. My name is Tim, and I live with cerebral palsy. Some of you may have noticed when I walked in here that I walked in here. I don't have a wheelchair. I don't use assistive devices, and for the most part, I try to be capable of doing anything and everything I can on my own. However, that does not mean that it's always been that way. That does not mean that it will always be that way, and it does not mean that I don't deal with things on a day-to-day basis because of my cerebral palsy. So, I'm going to take you on a 40,000-foot view of my life and the wider context, and then we're going to get into the trees of my life with CP, because living with a disability, just like being a person in any other capacity, is multi-dimensional. Give me a second. So, as I think about this, I'm 40 years old, and I've spent every day for my 40 years of life fighting to be seen, heard, and respected, and more. That all started when I was a child, and living in a household that was not necessarily always equipped to handle a child with a disability. In addition to living with CP, I also identify as an adult child of an alcoholic and a drug addict, both of whom rest in peace. I've also experienced all of the things that Stephen talked about on the disability definition within my own family. I've lost more members of my family than I can count due to things like mental illness, homelessness, and overdose. And then, on top of that, I live with cerebral palsy. So, I went on from being told as a child what I couldn't do, being told what I would never do, to doing all of it and then some, mostly in spite of the fact that I was told I could not. So if you pick up notes of attitude and defensiveness here tonight, that's not directed at you. That's my raw emotion coming out, and the part of me that as a teenager tried to protect all of this and hide it away because it's uncomfortable. So somebody asked me as I was preparing to do this whether or not I think that my life with a disability makes people uncomfortable. Absolutely. I think people in general tend to feel uncomfortable with things they don't understand, regardless of what it is. Sometimes even I'm uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable right now. So, you know, as we go into that, what was it like? So I was born with cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy happens around the birth process, either shortly before, during, or after. It is a muscle disorder caused by a brain injury. So I'm going to hit one of the FAQs real fast. No, I'm not done. So I was 2 months premature. In addition to the CP, there's usually, with a premature birth and cerebral palsy, there's usually other underlying conditions. I have no depth perception, so I don't drive, which we're all grateful for, especially the people that talked me out of it in my 20s. I had 7 surgeries before the age of 12, specifically related to CP and those related conditions. I've had 3 surgeries for my vision. I've had 2 surgeries for a condition called craniostenosis, which is basically where the bones of the skull fuse too soon and the brain keeps growing. And then I've also had 2 surgeries to lengthen my hamstrings and my heel cords. I spent every year from birth to age 12 in and out of hospitals, physical therapy offices, and handicap sports medicine programs. That's what they called it when I was growing up. That's what they called it where I lived. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, attending the nationally known children's hospital for all of these services. I spent my years from 2nd grade to 5th grade skiing every winter. I've climbed mountains, literally and figuratively. And at the age of 9, so I was probably in about the 4th grade at this point, I was told by school paraprofessionals you're going to need to be your own advocate. At the time, I thought, okay, that's kind of reasonable, but that stuck with me until right now. I have 6-year-old twins. I cannot fathom that in 3 years, or now, that they would be in a position to fully advocate for themselves as human beings for something that they're just learning to understand and that pretty much everyone around them doesn't understand or thinks they do or just doesn't want to. So I go from that into being a teenager. At this point, I'd experienced years of friends calling me names I won't repeat here, and things like that, because social stigmatism was real then, it's real now, and as much as we'd like to think we've evolved as human beings, all I have to do is look at the internet to know we haven't. So I wanted to get away from my life with CP. It was everything. It was in my face all the time. I even got to participate in a Special Olympics-like event right before my teen years. And that was kind of the last time that I was really like, let me be on board with this. When I went to high school, I purposely went to an art school so I didn't have to go to gym. Because I knew that that would take away most of that ridicule and most of the mistreatment. I was right in a lot of ways. What I wasn't expecting was that for most of the next several decades, my life with CP would take on an air of invisibility that I would contribute to. I didn't want to acknowledge it because I wanted to fit in. So I didn't want to stand out and I wanted to fit in, but I wasn't really doing well at either. And so I just wrestled with this constantly and then developed that attitude you heard bits and pieces of and a massive chip on my shoulder. So if anyone's watching on the live stream that has known me for longer than a few minutes, yeah, there you go. That's where that came from. So, you know, when I was a teenager, people just said, oh, you know, you're lazy. You can't do that. But they didn't ascribe it to my CP. They ascribed it to, you know, being a teenager and being lazy. And maybe sometimes I was. But it also meant that I wasn't speaking up. I wasn't being the advocate I was told at 9 that I should be. I wasn't saying to my friends like, hey, no, that's hard for me to do. You know, and most of the time for me, it's really minor things. Like, you know, when you're out with your friends, if you think back to your teen years or if you're a teenager now, and you're like, you know, you're just jumping around, you're hopping around things, climbing over things, doing parkour or something like that. You know, I'm like, oh, that's nice. Let me walk around that. I'm going to take the long way because I'm not climbing over that because I don't need you to pick me up off the ground because that'll just add to my already embarrassment. And so I spend all of these years not talking about CP, not talking about most of the things that I mentioned to you here today. There are things I've said in this conversation that I have never said publicly. I told my last supervisor last April that when I walk into work, only 5% of who I am comes in the door. I just blew the lid off of that tonight. So, thank you for giving me the space to do that. That is why I wanted to come here tonight, so that my story can help other people, because I figured if I held that in, and I've managed to do all of the things that people said that I couldn't do, that maybe somebody else wouldn't feel like they had to keep it all to the side. So we get into my 20s and the workforce. mind you, I was told that I would never work. And apart from a really lame high school job cleaning up the school, don't do that, I don't recommend it. If you've got to do it, I understand, but if you've ever met a teenager, no. I did that for like 2 months and then didn't work again until I graduated with my bachelor's degree in biblical studies for my first career in youth ministry, which I did for 3 reasons. The number one reason, which I'm going to say for the first time publicly, was because I could physically do the job. The number 2 reason was because at the time I was devoted to it. And the number 3 reason is because I'd rather wear jeans to work than a tie. Which isn't why I'm dressed casually tonight. I wanted to promote the fact that March is Cerebral Palsy Awareness Month, and so why not wear my CP Awareness t-shirt today? Otherwise, I probably would have, much to the irony of my prior statement, been here in a tie for you tonight. So, I'm 26. I've got my first professional job, really my first job since high school. I'm doing this job. Expectations are really high. I do that for a decade. I realize I don't fit in that world. I was also told at the end of that run that I didn't work hard enough. So, as a person who lives in constant perfectionism, whether that's from living with CP or living as an adult child of an alcoholic and a drug addict, I don't know which is which, but the fact of the matter is, I never wanted to hear that again. So what I went on to do was start a new career in libraries. I've been in the library field for 8 years. I've spent more than 30% of that at the top of my field. As a director of multiple public libraries, I am currently the assistant director of a 34,000 square foot library. And I'm a person people say, you will never do anything. With that, I'm sure there were some things that I missed in there that I wanted to say. I'm going to turn it back to Stephen for some questions.
All right. Well, that kicks off our conversation. I'm gonna, I shared some questions with Tim in advance, and I'm gonna jump around a little bit because what you were describing helped me. It made me think about something I wanted to ask, and I'm gonna ask all of you a question too. So, arguably, most of us are familiar with concepts of discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia. But I want to ask for a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the term ableism? Oh, this is a good group. Okay. I'm impressed because I have to say, before I started doing this work, I had never heard the term, and I've written reports on human rights and social justice. I had never heard the term. So that said, when you think about the concept of ableism and how it's played out in your life, what does it mean to you? And how does that affect you on a day-to-day and a personal basis?
Would you do me a favor for the sake of the point you just made and define it?
Ableism is coming from, and this is, I did not write down a definition, but basically ableism is coming from a place where the perspective of people who do not have a disability is assumed to be the norm. And it creates, it creates a structural barrier. And the way what I found interesting about it is, in a sense, conceptually turning that around and saying, is it about the person with the disability, or is it about a society that creates impediments to everyone being able to fully participate? What is it about?
Thank you. I appreciate that because, like yourself, that's not a term that I've heard often. So I should have said this at the start. I live with a disability, but by no means do I think I'm an expert. I've learned more about CP and things that probably kind of like disappeared in the fabric of my history in the last 2 years than I ever knew. So, circling back to your question, I do think that ableism tends to be defined by the outside world, or at least that is my experience. And I'll use an example from middle school. So I grew up in Denver. Denver Bronco fans are fanatics on a sort of like a 25 scale. And at the time I was like, oh yeah, let's be into football. Lots of people love football. And then one day I wanted to go play with my friends out on the field. And I realized really quickly that wasn't going to work out so well. Sometimes it was because they actually excluded me, and other times it was because they were being so physically aggressive that I was like, well, I'm going to be broken in half, so I'll sit this one out. And too bad at the time I wasn't a big reader like I am now, and didn't just go find the library, but I guess I can't not play the library even when that's not what I'm doing. So my whole world experience, the reason I wanted to come here tonight, aside from the altruistic goal of helping other people, I'm going to tell you that selfishly, I wanted to come here tonight because my experience isn't usually at the forefront of the conversation. It's not usually, oh, how do you experience that? It's not even that way for me at home. My imposter syndrome in here tonight is like through the roof. Because I'm like, hold on, I'm gonna go talk to people about how we can create awareness for disability when my own children don't even see it. But that's also a beautiful thing because most kids, and this is what I love about kids, most kids will ask questions about why I walk the way I do. Most grown-ups will not. My own children, however, just see dad. And so, when I tell them to clean up their toys because I don't want to tread, they're like, why would I do that? So I really think that it's hard to step outside of that perspective. But also, I want to make sure that I don't put that chip back on my shoulder and recognize that when I was a teenager, I did the same thing. I went back to the children's hospital with a classmate, and I remember this to this day, I was probably 17 or 18 years old. I was physically uncomfortable around the other kids with disabilities because at that point in my life, I was hiding that part of my truth as much as physically possible. And so we can all contribute to ableism, even if we're the person that is most impacted by it. We can all contribute to any of these. Some of the questions I got asked in preparation for this, and feel free to get me back on track here, Stephen, a lot of it were about professional things and job interviews, and I've said several times in job interviews when I'm asked about equity, diversity, and inclusion, I don't actually say the full thought. The full thought in my head is, well, don't tread on all of us. Let people be who they are, because we all have a given right as human beings to be treated with dignity and respect. But also, I don't want to be your poster child. I don't want to be the quota in your checkbox for whatever that is. And I'm not saying that's always the outcome of things like that, but we're going to talk about systems and organizations that are meant to help people. And a lot of times my experience has been the opposite of that. I have a fairly strong distrust in the government, not in a conspiracy level way, but more in a, if I had followed the path that was laid out for me, I would probably be living on SSI or SSD for the rest of my life, instead of carving out and creating a career and going on a 7-year streak of getting every job I applied for. You know, and if I sound like I'm bragging when I say that, I kind of am. Not because I want to brag, but because deep down inside, I'm still trying to prove myself to the royal you. Like, every time I'm talking to someone, I'm thinking, what do they think when they look at me? When I go into a job interview, my assumption is that, do I not fit your image because of how I move and how I walk? You know, for instance, you know, we all put on faces. We all put on a show every day. Like, we get dressed up to go to work, things like that. It takes me an hour just to get ready to look like this, okay? And I'm not saying I look bad, but at the same time, like, if I'm gonna put on nicer clothes and a suit and a tie, I might as well add an extra 30 minutes to that process. And so that throws a whole lot of stereotypes through the loop in my household. It's like, why aren't you ready yet? We gotta go. You know? You need to go back to questions. I'm gonna just.
No. That's it. This is great. And it's interesting because, you know, one of the things that came out of, one of the positives of the COVID pandemic was remote work really supported many more people with disabilities being able to be employed and, in a sense, not having to face some of those concerns in the workplace because we're all boxes on the screen. It's really made a difference, and it's one of those things I've thought about as you've had, you know, some efforts to bring everyone back to the office, which I could do a session on that myself. But it really does speak to how do we or don't we support and have expectations, but what do we carry ourselves? You know, our internalized depression is a real thing, you know, as you've just discussed. Well, let's talk a bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act, because I think a misperception for people who don't think about disability, which is a lot of people, was that, you know, this landmark 1990 Act, you know, which prohibits discrimination based on disability status, it requires accessibility and public accommodations, as well as reasonable accommodations for employees, solved everything. My sense is it really didn't. So, I mean, what was positive that came out of the Americans with Disabilities Act from your perspective, from your experience, and where does it fall short?
Well, I think the positive aspect is that it exists, and that's probably about it. From my perspective, there might be people with greater expertise in the nuances of the ADA that could speak better to that, but from my perspective, it's a baseline that is generally inadequate. However, I believe it is in the ADA that also has the rule that when you are seeking employment, the prospective employer does not have legal grounds to ask you about a disability, even if you self-disclose. And so that's a positive, right? Because I've spent most of my career not talking about it, or talking around it. And probably the biggest element of that on a professional level tends to be the fact that I don't drive. I really wish the driver's license requirement on most job applications was non-existent, especially if you know, I'm not operating a vehicle that needs a CDL or a vehicle at all. So, you know, why is that on the job application? But ultimately, I think there's more shortfall to the ADA than there are positives. And I probably don't even, personally, I probably don't even benefit from most of the things that it's intended to benefit. So, you know, maybe there are people that do receive greater benefit from the ADA. But
So, in the philanthropic sector where I do my work, we often hear people talking about the curb cut effect. All right, and what this relates to is, as part of the ADA, one of the benefits was, in terms of mobility, that there be curb cuts on street corners to allow for greater mobility. And it turned out that it just wasn't disabled people who were benefiting. It was parents with strollers, it was older adults. It provided a broad community benefit. On a call just the week before last, one of the speakers referenced this stat, take it as you will, but that 90% of innovation in education comes from work done with students with disabilities, which when you think about it, makes a lot of sense. So Tim, do you have any examples of accommodations that you've seen that have ultimately benefited the community beyond people with disabilities?
Yes, I do. Bring me back to that in a second, because you said the phrase curb cut effect, and my brain automatically wandered to sidewalks. I could probably do a whole forum on sidewalks, don't worry. Because as somebody who regularly is commuting on foot, if not by alternative forms of transportation, we tend to make sidewalks aesthetic more than functional. So when they are functional, I love that. When they do have the curb cut for the wheelchairs and the strollers and other things of that nature, it's super beneficial. It's not so beneficial when the snowplows put all the snow on the sidewalk. And then it turns into ice, and suddenly I decide, can I hibernate for 6 months and still have a job? No. And you know, so going back to where those innovations actually help people. You know, you mentioned strollers, and that automatically made me think of the ADA operator buttons on an automatic door. If you've ever pushed a stroller, people don't hold doors for people with strollers. So those buttons are very useful. You know, we've now entered the technological age of AI and smart devices, and for all of the cons that come with that, being able to dictate speech to text with relative ease, or do voice searching and things like that. I know as a librarian I'm probably not supposed to promote that, but like that's super beneficial for everyone, but it's also particularly beneficial if that was the accessibility need that you needed. And now you don't have to, because they're becoming native features to devices and things that we use, now you don't have to go through the clunky accessibility settings that once you turn them on, you're like, how do I turn this off? Because now the computer's gone haywire and I don't know how to fix this. You know, like the thought that I can use my own voice to write an entire like chunk of text in a fraction of the time that it would take me to type it. And when I say type, I mean two-finger typing, because actual typing just didn't happen. It was along the list with riding a bike and driving a car and all those things. So we have great use of technology that most of it started for an accessibility function and is only getting better. The real challenge will be, can we use that for good instead of to just, you know, work less hard?
That's a great point. And I have to say, I mean, looking at the ADA compliant bathrooms in terms of being able to age in place, and websites that are designed to be flexible as my eyes get older, I think, oh, thank goodness this exists. It wasn't intended for me as a primary audience, but I'm absolutely a beneficiary of that. So my final question is around the phrase that was pioneered by the disability community, nothing about us without us. And Tim, in your words, what does that concept mean to you? And why do you think it's so important to the disability community?
It's funny. So, and I'm gonna let the cat out of the bag here. I knew you were gonna ask me that question. And I've been racking my brain for how to answer that question for days. And there's a multitude of reasons for that. Part of it is because in spite of everything that's already been said here tonight, like I said, I have imposter syndrome. Like, as a person with cerebral palsy, I have a type of cerebral palsy. It's called spastic diplegia CP. I'm not a quadriplegic. I'm not a paraplegic. So for me, I'm like, I got really fortunate. I got really fortunate that that's not the case. But at the same time, nothing about us without us. If I circle back and I step away from feeling afraid or like I'm not good enough to answer that question, it means that finally I can speak my truth and be heard instead of somebody else speaking for me, because that's usually how that works.
That's great. Tim, well, you're not going anywhere. So what we want to do now is open it up to all of you. So I don't know if you have questions to start at, but I will say one I'll throw out there that we don't need to touch on right away, but keep in mind is, how well is our town serving the needs of people with disabilities? But really, I want to hear from you, and if you have a question, I will pass the mic to you so that everyone can hear you. And I will wait you out, because I know people have questions or comments.
I'm going to piggyback off of that for a second. So, one of the things I meant to say earlier was that if we really want to benefit this conversation, we've got to ask questions. So, I would invite and encourage you to ask whatever you want. And I will, for any questions you direct specifically at me, I'll answer any question you have, except maybe questions about my kids. But other than that, anything I said here tonight, fair game, I'll answer a question.
Yeah. Start right here.
Hi, my name is Lana. So you said you would answer anything. I am very curious the background that you grew up in, the parents that you had, who, I mean, you were able to go to therapies, you were able to get a lot of the services. I'm just wondering who that support system was.
So as I was doing that intro, I probably panicked a little bit because doing this is very nerve-wracking for me. And as we've settled in, I've gotten more comfortable. But when I was younger, my family hadn't fallen apart to the extent that it has now. And I mentioned that I spent decades in the church. My parents at one point in time had turned their lives over to the faith, and so they were mostly clean and mostly sober. And so during my childhood, most of my early memories that are in the hospital, which are most of my earliest memories, my dad is the one that's right there. And if I can get through the rest of this sentence without crying, it's gonna be difficult because, childhood me. So little Timmy loved his dad. My dad was my hero, my support system, my everything. Teenager me wanted to knock my dad out. Adult me was in denial for a really long time until I realized that my dad's addictive habits never really left him, and that it was the only thing he cared about on this earth. And so, I went through phases and stages with that. And fortunately, at the time that I probably most needed it as a child, I had a support network. So that's also one thing that I think is a sort of a systemic inadequacy, regardless of my specific experience. So from birth to age 12, I had an onslaught of treatment in hospitals, and doctors, specialists, physical therapists, all of that. And then after that, it was like nothing. Like I had a few, I think my last appointment with a CP specialist before a couple of years ago was when I was 18. They're like, okay, they wanted to make sure, because I mentioned I had the related condition of the cranial stenosis, they wanted to make sure that my skull had fully formed to the size that it was supposed to be for an 18-year-old male. And it had, so I checked that box. They're like, see you bye. And I didn't see another specialist until 2 years ago for that. Like I'd seen, regular doctors and things like that. But, so I really had that support. I had an IEP throughout my educational years, and particularly in elementary and middle school, there was a lot of focus on that. I went through phases of learning disability pieces. I went through forgive me if I'm using incorrect terminology at this point, the special ed courses for reading and writing, and then at some point shifted from that to like actually being gifted and talented programs. So there's certain skills that I still compensate for and work on a daily basis. And I mentioned that a couple of years ago I started seeing specialists again. I tested last year. I'm in the top 2% for my verbal processing abilities, which doesn't really surprise me because my brain is my biggest asset. But my perceptual reasoning abilities, something that's a tremendous tool for a librarian and being able to organize objects and spaces, aren't that great, actually. And anyone that's worked the circ desk with me knows that I hate pulling the holes for that reason. Well, they don't know that's the reason, but they might now. So, remind me what the question was.
It was the support system.
Thank you. So the support systems really went in phases and stages. And I think finally now I'm being my own advocate. Like nobody told me I needed to go see those specialists. I started to not be able to ignore the aches and pains. I started to not be able to ignore that it was getting harder to move and do certain things the way that I'd always done them. Because, I said when I was a teenager that I wanted to like stuff this up, so I lived without limits. I literally hung upside down off the side of a mountain because I was determined to do it. I don't recommend that if you, want to do things safely. But, that has taken a physical toll on me to live that way. It's also taken an emotional toll on me to live that way. And so I had to make a choice. Do I research how is CP going to affect me as I get older? Because it's a non-progressive issue. But people age, and as we age, we can't do things the way that we used to do when we were younger, regardless of what we live with. And I wanted to have the best quality of life I could possibly have. So I am constantly trying to work on that now and running into new roadblocks with that. I have a wonderful job that I couldn't be more grateful for, and yet insurance doesn't want to cover me going to PT because it's a chronic condition, not an injury. So they don't want to cover it. So I have to fight that literally every week when I go in. I'm like, okay, fill out the form again. I feel bad for the people that work in the field because all they're doing is filling out paperwork every time people like myself come in to have routine treatment, just so I can live a functional, healthy life and, maybe attempt to keep up with my kids.
Hi, I'm David. That talk has been great. So you had said that kids are often more relaxed, and I'm wondering, can you give us some guidelines or thoughts about a thoughtful way to interact with you or a person of different abilities that is engaging and natural and human?
So I think that's a really contextual issue, right? For me personally, I love it when I hear kids say, and I always hear it in earshot, because usually they're not saying it to me directly, they're saying it to whoever the grown-up is with them, right? Because these are kids that don't know me, like they're total strangers. And they've probably been taught not to talk to strangers, so they don't ask me, they ask their grown-up. I love that they ask, because it's honest, it's real. I do walk different, so ask the question. Don't be afraid of that. But some people might not want you to. Some people might want you to leave them alone. So, you know, that's a really contextual issue. For me, I think because I've kind of been 1 foot in and out of the realm of disability with invisibility, I would much rather you ask the question than not. What makes me uncomfortable is when I get 2 to 5 minutes in a conversation with someone and touch on the stuff that I talked to you about here tonight, and within 2 minutes I can tell they're uncomfortable, they've had enough, they don't want any more. That makes me uncomfortable, because that means, okay, I can't really be who I am. You know, I've had people say, you're too intense, you're not fun, literally these little quotes. I'm like, I don't know how you would not be, but you know, that doesn't mean I can't laugh and have a good time. I've been making jokes all night. But, you know, so we have to contextualize how we approach that. I think it's important to ask the questions, because if we don't ask questions, we don't have conversation. Plus, my experience is different from your experience, and how do we learn? We converse, right? I don't know everything there is to know about having a disability. I don't know everything there is to know about having CP, and that's the disability I have, right? So we're learning together, and our willingness to do that comes from being willing to have the conversations and to step outside of the comfort zones and to make the uncomfortable of the unknown a little more comfortable.
Hi. We met earlier, Laura. You mentioned self-disclosing during an interview. So when you're being interviewed, the person doing the interview, should they stop you from self-disclosing, or should they, if they happen to, what kind of questions should they not ask, or I'm just trying to figure out a situation like that.
So if they're working with a human resources professional, or they are the human resources professional, odds are they know they legally can't ask, so they don't. As far as stopping the disclosure, no, they really shouldn't. But they also probably aren't going to, unless the response is somewhat vague and surface level, they probably aren't going to follow up with a specific response to that. And in my own experience, I've conducted a number of interviews. I've also participated in a number of interviews. I have not always self-disclosed that. Really, I can tell you, it was in my last 2 jobs, so my current job and the one before that, which actually consists of 3 different interview cycles. So in my most recent library directorship, so the job before now, I expressed an interest to do more of what I'm doing here with you tonight. And I knew that was a calculated risk, because at the time I didn't know that they legally couldn't respond. I learned that after the fact. But I realized from the job I had before that, which was also a library director position, my board chairperson didn't know I couldn't drive until like 2 months before I left the job, because I didn't tell anyone. I just made my way around, and that's what I hadn't driven really ever, so like I just accommodated for that all the time, and it's been a tremendous networking tool. As far as the interviews go, so I'm in my interview cycle for my second library directorship, and I'm talking about wanting to do more of this, and that actually led to a conversation with my then supervisor after they offered me the job about reasonable accommodations. This was 2022. It's the first time ever in my employment life that I'd had a conversation about reasonable accommodations that I didn't have to initiate. And because of that, I was like, you don't have to do anything. Like, I was just kind of awkward and clamoring about it, and ultimately they were like, well, instead of you coming to my office for meetings, which was in a different building, they came to my office for meetings, which ended up being really cool. Saved me a lot of money on Uber. So then in the interview for the job I currently have, which was the best interview I've ever had in my career, I talked openly about being a person with a disability, and I told this individual, this is the same individual that I said I come into work and I only show 5% of who I am. I told them that I wanted to use ministry because I could physically do the job. I'm like, this is not something you really want to self-disclose in an interview, right? Like, they're a well-respected colleague and have been for a number of years, so I had a trust factor there that people don't typically have when you go into a job interview and you're just meeting people for the first time, right? So, like, at some level, I felt comfortable. And also, this was a brilliant strategy on their part as an interviewer. I came in to interview on a Saturday, and they said, you know what, we observe casual Saturdays here. So I showed up to the interview, dressed pretty much like I'm dressed right now. And that was the most comfortable interview I've ever had, because I was able to just be myself. They offered me that job. So I've had another interview cycle since then. I interviewed to be the director at the library that I still work at. I did not get that job. So that notched the chip on my shoulder a little bit. But I self-disclosed in that interview too. But that was more, I self-disclosed in that interview when they asked me about library DEI efforts. And I don't know if they want me to share this publicly, but I'm gonna. So I point blank said, if I am your staff version of inclusivity, we need to work on it. I mean, I don't feel like that's a deep criticism, it's just the truth. Everyone can work harder on being more inclusive, because we need to be more inclusive of people. Regardless of who we are, what our background is, what the thing is that makes us other from one another. So hopefully that answered the actual question.
It was great, and I wanted to just add from the data perspective, it's a really interesting challenge. There's a real catch-22 with people self-disclosing disability. And in essence, the only way we're going to understand if we're making progress is by being able to track and say, more staff, more leaders, more what have you, are people with disabilities taking on these roles, but yet feeling safe to disclose, feeling it's not somehow going to compromise your opportunities for promotion or even just how people are engaging with you on a day-to-day basis, and particularly for mental health, substance use disorders, where there continues to be so much stigma in society. We're making a little progress, maybe another silver lining possibly out of COVID, but you know, it's a real challenge. So how wonderful that you were in a space and at a place where you felt comfortable disclosing and prepared to do that.
Yeah, it is on one token, and it's something I will cherish personally and professionally for the rest of my life. However, at the same time, at the time when I was 39, when I had that interview, like, it took me that long. And most of the stuff we talk about being stigmatized, most of the stuff we've touched on here tonight, both in sort of a general level and also in my personal context, like everything I shared with you tonight has been stigmatized in one way, shape, or form, whether it was about me specifically or about my family of origin and the things that I experienced, right? So, like, I'm not surprised that I've spent most of my life not wanting to talk about this. Like, my biggest fear out of tonight's conversation is, oh, people are gonna know this stuff now. Like, and now I'm gonna have to talk about it. You know, in varying degrees. But when you see those stigmatisms happen in subtle human ways, like a snub or, you know, a change in tone, you know, or a look of pity or concern that doesn't need to be, or I pick on this one a lot. When I climb a ladder, I watch the faces. Everyone's making a face. I'm like, but when they go climb a ladder, no one's looking. Like, what does it matter? If I fall off the ladder or they fall off the ladder, we're filling out the workers' comp claim. You know, so, yeah, absolutely.
Other questions?
So I really thank you for sharing such a kind of breadth of your life, because I know you said sometimes people are saying, hey, you're too intense or not fun, which I don't know how, because you have perfect comic timing. But the reason I wanted to comment on that is because all these things are little parts of us, right? And so whether your intensity or how you joke about things maybe it does or maybe it doesn't have anything to do with the CV. And I think sometimes we focus on one thing and ascribe everything to that rather than just realize they're all parts of the person. My question was, if you could look back at your childhood now and think of maybe the folks or the kids in your school at any point who were the people who made the difference, who were friends, who you could be yourself with as much as you would let yourself be. What are those traits? What are those things? And are there some things that either our children, I have 2 kids, or our community or us can really learn from that?
Thank you. I'm going to pause on that one for a second, mostly just to take that in, because that's a really big question, as was your lead up with the context, which is why I shared those other pieces. I could have very well chosen to just talk about the CVs and to leave the rest of that out. But that would be dishonest. And I gave myself one goal tonight, to come in here and tell the truth. So as far as friends in my childhood, like, it's been different in different phases and stages of life, but specifically in childhood. So in my childhood, I didn't hide. I was proud but I also didn't have the chip on my shoulder that I developed over the years. I was generally a gentle and sensitive kid. So when peers would call me names and things like that, I grew up in the era where I was like, all right, let's go fight after school. And then my peers, who really saw me and didn't tolerate any of that, would be like, no, let's not do this. That's not gonna go well, because your mouth is getting you into situations that you can't get your way out of. So don't. That's still kind of a problem if you didn't notice, but I don't know how I cultivated the most genuine relationships, but I do know that both good and bad, I'm a relationship person. So most of the friends I have today, I've been friends with for almost decades. Because if I'm really your friend, I'm not going to hide from these conversations. I'm going to go into those deep waters. That's my comfort zone. I want to talk to you about that because I need to talk about this because it lives inside all the time and I'll go nuts if I don't. And as a kid, it was the kids who didn't go, oh, Timmy walks funny. It was the kids who were like, hey, you want to play Nintendo? Hey, you want to go to the park? Hey, you want to do this, that, or the other? Like, the ones who, they didn't ignore it, but they accepted it, right? And I think that's a pretty big distinction because the ignoring part came more in my teen years. However, the dynamic of authentic friendships of people who would see me for who I was still a fact. I had a friend from probably first grade through like our early 20s until we veered paths and lost touch of things that happen in life. And if they were here today, they would probably be proud that I'm sitting here having this conversation. They would also probably laugh at some of the things that I just said about calling people out to the field because they were one of the people that were like, by the time I hit high school, like, if you keep doing this, I'm gonna kick your butt because I don't want to have to keep going out into the fight for you. So, good friends speak truth, right? They speak truth in kindness, compassion, and love, if I can say that in an open public forum. Good friends are the ones that will have the conversation that you want to have and the conversation that you don't.
Hi, my name is Islan. Thank you for speaking your truth today. So I am a mom of a 6-year-old little girl that has cerebral palsy. We are very busy. I take her to multiple appointments, PT, OT, speech, and CP specialists, and other specialists. And my question to you is, to the best of your recollection, what was it like for you to be taken to appointments, to be taken to see specialists, and what was it like to have people work with you, to have a physical therapist work with you hands-on, like that?
Thank you for sharing. I think probably not too dissimilar from the experience that I would imagine your child was having. it happens so frequently. It's probably what helped me develop my ability to talk to you the way that I do. You know, I've spent more of my life talking to adults before I was one. And usually, you know, highly educated, trained adults, because they're doctors and physicians and physical therapists and occupational therapists and all that, right? I know that there were moments that was terrifying, and unfortunately those are usually like the early childhood memories of pre-op or post-op for me. Like I'm seeing the images now as I'm telling that to you. But as far as like day to day, like going to the appointments and working with the people, typically, at least in my experience, and I hope this is the same for your child, those were the people that saw me, right? Like, yeah, they were doing their job to help me, but like, that's why they got into it. They wanted to help kids like me have a better experience, have a better life, you know, I think this is where probably our medical profession has changed since then. They would spend hours crafting like brace-like devices to correct my gait that would go inside of my shoe. Those weren't comfortable, I vividly remember that. But like the hands-on part, I got used to it after a while. I don't really remember being like, oh, I've had enough of this. I remember either being grateful that they cared or scared that I had to go through it. Those are probably the most common memories that I have of those experiences. But like going to PT was usually a little bit more fun. And now that I'm going to PT again, I joke about doing all the things that I hated as a kid, as an adult, because I still don't like them. But unlike when I was a kid, I'm like, are we done yet? I'm like, okay, I don't want to do that. I think that's terrible. But I know if I put in the work, it's going to help. So, all right. Thank you. And I hope that your child has the best possible experience getting through the challenges of childhood CP that is possible. And I hope you hear from my story tonight that the glass ceiling doesn't have to exist, and when it shows up, you can kick it in.
You know, I appreciate that, because when I jotted one little note to myself just before, and it was the phrase, the lowered expectations of well-intentioned people. And I was thinking of myself and ways that I have done this and have been doing this in my own life, and that's a form of ableism. And not just saying, no, you really, if you want it, you keep pushing for it and you make it happen. So I really, I feel like sometimes people come into your life at the right time, or that message comes at the right time, and that for me personally really resonates.
It's a balance though, right? Because I feel like I have to be better than the royal you at everything I do, and constantly like just go, just strive to be perfect. Frankly, nobody's perfect, but like that's the feeling inside. Like I do not ever feel good enough at anything, and I cannot believe I just said that out loud.
But it's hard. That's why you're so good at what you do. Any other questions? Yes.
I have my notes. You asked about our experiences, and we were to talk about experiences in Woodbridge, so that's what I'm going to talk about. I grew up in Woodbridge, and I came back to raise my children. My younger daughter, who's now 19, has multiple disabilities. The most obvious one now is autism, but when she was young, it was medical disabilities that kept us very, very, very busy. but those same disabilities prevented her from making any friends in elementary school. Not because of who she was or how she projected herself so much as it's very hard to find a parent of another child willing to take my child for a play date when she's at risk of seizure and she's G-tube fed. So that was our challenge growing up, so that by the time she got to high school, having a friend group was, virtually impossible. So my question and challenge for everyone is, how do we teach the community to be more welcoming, more compassionate, more inclusive, friendlier, kinder? Because it's easy for us as we're going through the PPT meetings at the school to blame the teachers and the administration for not doing their job, not doing a better job with accommodations. But in reality, if the students surrounding our kids are not including our kids, except for a token once a month unified sports day, which is what they like to brag about, it becomes a very frustrating existence for us as parents. I don't know the answer.
I appreciate you sharing that.
I have so many questions. But one that kind of piggybacks off of what Cleo just said is, I guess I'm just looking for advice. I also have a child with a disability, and this is our parent support group right over here. I guess I'm curious if you have any advice for how us parents can support our child with the potential of bullying, the difficulties in finding friends. I almost want to just go out and make friends for her. That's not the natural way. Do we just, make friends with other kids with disabilities? Would that be the way? I'm not sure. My daughter can't talk to me, can't tell me. So I really absorb your words, and your whole talk tonight has just been brilliant, and I don't pray for me. Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't know if there's one way to do that, right? And like I said earlier about some of the points, it's got texture. So your daughter has a unique context of how her abilities present opportunities, which you might not feel able at the moment, maybe. I don't want to speak for you, but and also challenge in making friends. Right? Making friends for kids, I think, has its challenges, period. But I'm looking at this like two ways right now. So I'm looking at like my childhood experience and what it was like making friends, and the few that didn't succumb to the peer pressure and eventually participate in the negative behavior, because that did happen. Like people that were actually my friends would participate in it. So I'm also looking at this as a parent and recognizing the trepidation of what's it going to be like for my kid to experience social stigmatism in any way, shape, and so in order to answer your question, I don't know if I can adequately answer your question, to be quite honest with you, but any kid with a disability needs to have the opportunity to make friends. And yes, they may make some good friends through their disability community. I certainly did that when I was skiing and going through these programs. But as far as like day to day in school, when they're surrounded by other kids with different experiences, it's trying, if you have to make initial connections for them with parents of other kids, just like at a play date, or some sort of way for them to interact, or to just observe too. You know, use the network we have, use the school teachers, anyone that's spending adequate time around your kids. Like, what do they observe? Who are the kids that are most likely to come up and talk to them, to engage? Because for me, that happened kind of organically. Like, it wasn't that, you know, a lot of kids didn't want to be my friend. Whether that was because of my CP or because I didn't stop talking, I don't know. But the ones that did, like, they just kind of happened. Like, I don't really recall like defining moments like I'm almost thinking like a movie right now where like you have that moment where like, oh, this is when we became friends, right? I think, you know, connected social circles, whether you can do it through school or you can do it through a peer group, or, you know, if you participate in a religious group, that was a big thing for me at various phases of life. Anything that provides a social opportunity. The library, actually, children's programs at the library, especially the more socially interactive ones, not so much the, you know, come watch somebody juggle and then go home. That's a great program. You should go if they're having it. But it, you know, in this context, like, that's not going to help with the social element as much. But, you know, if, like, for instance, if you're doing like a summer reading kickoff program, there's like an ice cream social or something like that. Anything where the kids can interact just naturally in any way, because kids who want to be friends with each other and gravitate towards each other are just like adults who want to be friends with each other and gravitate towards each other. Like, I am a failed expert in human relationships because of most of the stuff I've shared with you tonight. For every relationship that I have that's decades long, there's a list a mile long of ones that look like a, you know, just went through a dystopian film. And so I think it's going to happen the way that it happens, and that's a really lame answer. At least I feel like it is, because you're in a position you need to hear something that's going to provide an avenue of hope. I know that it's possible. That I know is true. Like, I know that it's possible to make friends when you're in a situation and you have a disability that puts you on an outline framework from the people around you on a day-to-day basis. It's possible to make that community. How to do that, especially as a child? Just gotta let kids be kids and hope it happens. Tim?
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. We actually have a question from the folks that are watching this on the YouTube channel.
Okay.
So yeah, the folks on the WGA TV 79 YouTube are also watching this. We've actually had a few in tonight, and we have a question from one of them which reads, thank you for sharing your story, and my apologies if this has been answered already. As a teenager, what did you think your family and friends could have done for you to emotionally support you more? Is the question that's read on the YouTube channel.
Well, I probably would have had to allow them to do that as a teenager, and as a teenager, I wasn't having much of that. You know, I think for my friends, probably treating me a little less like I was just like everyone else, but not to the extent that happens to me as an adult, where people are either over caretaking or completely like nothing. It's either too much or nothing. Like, find the middle. So I think that's probably what would have been helpful as a teenager, but as a teenager I also would have had to be willing, and I just wasn't.
We're going to take one final question.
It's great because it's softball for a librarian. Is there a genre of book that you have been really into lately, and do you have a favorite book recommendation for us today?
So I mostly read nonfiction, although this year I've read a fair amount of fiction. But since we're talking about disability awareness and things that connect for people's stories, I'm actually going to share a couple of those types. So on the nonfiction side, there's a book called One More Step by Barnard Paddock. He climbed Kilimanjaro with the SCP and did a number of other amazing things. Well worth the read, and that was a book that made me as a person with CBD feel seen. On the entertainment side, the first installment of the Curse Breakers series, which is a YA novel, basically, I think Jen told me it's a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. There is a character in there, one of the lead characters, who has CP. And I'm sure there's been other fictional titles, in fact I've read a few since, where there's characters that have CP, but none that hit sort of the level of popularity that series did. And I was disappointed that after the first book that character's not in there. Sorry if I spoiled that. But I think anything that allows me to cultivate more knowledge is really what I love to read. So if I can learn from it, if I can chew on it, and spend too many hours in deep thought, then that's what I'm doing.
I'm going to throw in a plug for a disability-specific book written by a colleague of mine, Emily Liddell. It's called Demystifying Disability. And I think it is one of the best primers I've seen on really understanding the experience of disability and how people who do not have disabilities need to think about, engage, reflects a lot of what you've shared with us tonight, Tim. And I just have to say, I am so grateful to you for having come and shared your experience. I have truly learned so much, and I really appreciate all of you. And coming out and sharing this, because it's by sharing our stories that we build community, and we build greater understanding of what our community looks like, because it's very easy any place, and particularly in a place as spread out as Woodbridge, to just assume, everyone's kind of just the same and homogenous, and it's like, no, we're all having very different experiences, but yet there are so many shared experiences that we don't necessarily get to communicate about. So thank you to the library for this opportunity to have this conversation, and really spread the word. Spread the word. And Tim, thank you so much.
I'll see if there are any cookies left.
Well, now that you said that, you better run.
Exactly.